In the summer of 1867, in a remote farming community outside Sedalia, Missouri, a young boy named Timothy Caldwell would become the center of a medical case study that, even today, chills the blood. Dr. Samuel Harding, the only physician for miles, didn't just record what he saw. He wrote it down in 3 separate leather-bound journals, filled with observations about a child whose behavior seemed to defy nearly every principle of human nature understood by 19th-century medicine. From a distance, Timothy appeared ordinary, sometimes even charming. People thought he was polite, well-mannered, and harmless. But beneath that innocent exterior, something darker lived, something medical science of the era could not explain. For nearly 6 months, a streak of deaths followed Timothy. 3 people died in accidents, and then came the unnerving part. Dozens of farm animals were found dead under circumstances that never made sense. Over time, more people began to notice the same pattern. Whenever Timothy showed up, misfortune didn't just happen, it seemed to cluster. Even worse, the official records were eventually sealed by local authorities and hidden away for more than a century. And the truth, if what Dr. Harding believed was correct, would challenge everything people once thought about how evil could appear in childhood. Before we dive further into Timothy Caldwell and the terror that gripped Sedalia County, consider this. If this story intrigues you, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And please, drop a comment and tell us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from mystery enthusiasts all around the world. Now, the events that would make Timothy Caldwell infamous didn't begin with violence. They began with loss. You have to remember what Missouri was like in 1867. The state was still healing from the wounds of the Civil War. Towns like Sedalia had sent their young men to fight, and many never returned. That meant the countryside was full of families trying to rebuild with grief in their houses and empty spaces at their tables. The Caldwell farm was one of those places. It sat in a valley about 15 miles south of town, once prosperous, once hopeful. James and Martha Caldwell had built their homestead with dreams of raising cattle and planting corn. But those dreams broke apart one by one. James Caldwell died at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. Martha tried to keep the farm alive after his death, but then came the winter of 1865, and consumption, tuberculosis, took her lungs. When Martha died, their son Thomas Caldwell inherited land he couldn't fully work and debts he couldn't easily pay. Then, when Thomas received word that his brother William had died at Andersonville Prison, leaving behind a widow and an 8-year-old son, Thomas suddenly saw both burden and opportunity. The boy would need a home. Thomas would need help with the work. So Timothy Caldwell arrived on the farm in the spring of 1866. No fanfare. No ceremony. He carried only a small cloth bag, and his eyes, pale blue, too old-looking for an 8-year-old, seemed to carry something that didn't belong in a child's face. Timothy was small for his age. His pale skin burned too easily in Missouri's sunlight, and his blonde hair, kept cut short by his Aunt Sarah, was often trimmed because lice had become a concern. When he spoke, he didn't talk much about what came before. If adults pressed, he gave only fragments. He said his father had been a soldier. He said his mother had coughed blood. He said he lived with neighbors for a while after she died. And yet, what struck adults most was how polite Timothy was. He always said, "Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am." He never complained about chores. He didn't resist punishment. He didn't seem angry or bitter like many children would be after the kind of losses Timothy had already survived. To casual observers, Timothy Caldwell seemed like the model of a well-behaved child. But Dr. Samuel Harding noticed something else almost immediately. Dr. Harding first met Timothy in June 1866, when the boy accompanied his uncle into town for supplies. Harding wasn't just a physician. He was one of the few men in the region with formal training, and he'd spent years treating both Union and Confederate soldiers. After seeing what soldiers did to their bodies, and what war did to their minds, Harding developed a habit of reading people. He learned to look past the obvious. Something about Timothy unsettled him, though he couldn't name exactly why. The boy acted respectful. He answered questions directly. He maintained eye contact the way adults wanted him to. He didn't fidget. He wasn't shy in the way most rural children were when meeting a stranger. Still, Harding wrote later that he felt deeply uncomfortable standing in front of him. His gaze didn't wander. It didn't soften. It felt like Timothy was studying Harding in the same clinical way Harding studied patients. And in a small farming community, you can't hide for long. Neighbors didn't just see Timothy once. They saw him again and again. The Caldwell farm was isolated, but not so isolated that people nearby never noticed. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose property bordered the Caldwell land, began to watch Timothy working in the fields and tending livestock. She said Timothy worked with an unusual intensity. He didn't seem to tire. He rarely stopped to play. He didn't behave the way children normally do. It was like watching a machine, she told her husband. And then the animals began to react. The Pattersons kept chickens. Eleanor noticed the birds would grow agitated when Timothy got near the property line. They would cluster together, squawk, and refuse to move close to the fence separating the farms. Her husband chalked it up to coincidence. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that animals somehow detected something humans missed. Then the first death came. It happened in August 1866. A little girl named Mary Fletcher, age 5, was the daughter of the town blacksmith. Everyone knew her for her laughter and her tendency to wander. Mary wandered near Willow Creek, a shallow stream running between multiple properties, including the Caldwell farm. Timothy found her body. He arrived at the Fletcher home just as the family prepared for supper, his clothes damp and his face pale with what seemed, at least at first, like genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said in a steady voice, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." A search party rushed to the creek and found Mary face down, in water only about 18 inches deep. Dr. Harding was summoned immediately. He ruled it a drowning, tragic, but not uncommon in rural areas where children played too close to water. But what bothered Harding wasn't the death itself. It was Timothy's account. Timothy gave unusually detailed information about exactly where the body had been found, the position of Mary's limbs, the condition of her clothing, the exact nature of the water around her face. When Harding pressed Timothy about how he ended up at that exact spot, Timothy explained he had been searching for a lost calf. And it seemed believable, because the calf was indeed missing that morning. It was found 2 days later, healthy and grazing in a meadow nearly a mile away from where Mary had drowned. The Fletcher family received Timothy's sympathy with gratitude. At the funeral, Timothy sat quietly with his aunt and uncle. His head remained bowed respectfully. People thanked him for finding Mary so quickly, and Timothy accepted their gratitude with solemn politeness. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he told Mary's father, in the right tone of regret and sorrow. But Eleanor Patterson watched from across the church and noticed something that bothered her for days afterward. When Mary Fletcher's mother collapsed in grief during the service, grown men had to help her. Tears fell. Grief took over. Timothy's face didn't change much. His head was bowed like everyone expected. His pale blue eyes stayed dry and watchful, taking in details of the room as if he were observing more than grieving. The second death came only 3 weeks later. Old Henrik Lind, a Norwegian immigrant, was known around town. He once worked as a logger before arthritis forced him into retirement. He climbed to Devil's Bluff regularly, where he checked wild beehives. Timothy Caldwell was involved again. He was walking home from town when he spotted something unusual at the base of the bluff. "I saw Mr. Lenshack caught on a thorn bush," Timothy told the crowd. "I called out to him, but got no answer. So I climbed down to look." Henrik Larsson was dead. His neck was broken, likely from a fall from the top of a 40-foot bluff. Dr. Harding examined Henrik and concluded the old man likely died instantly from impact. What bothered Harding wasn't only the death, it was the bees. There were several dead bees scattered near Henrik's body, more than would normally appear away from a hive. Even stranger, Henrik had known those bluffs better than anyone. He climbed them for years without a stumble. So how did he fall now? Timothy suggested a theory. He said maybe Henrik had been stung and lost footing. He talked about how angry bees get when you disturb them. He explained it calmly, almost like teaching a lesson. "Maybe they swarmed him," Timothy said. "Maybe he got confused." Harding considered the idea. But then he noticed the bees weren't spread out. They were clustered in a tight area around Henrik's impact point. If Henrik had disturbed a hive during a climb or flight, the scene should have shown evidence along a path. More bees, more signs, more disorder. Instead, it looked as if the bees had somehow concentrated at the moment the fall happened. And when Harding climbed to the top to inspect the beehives, he found them intact. The bees were working normally, gathering nectar. They showed no signs of disturbance. The third death ended any lingering doubt that this was coincidence. In September 1866, Jacob Mills, age 6, vanished while playing in the woods near his family's cabin. His body was found 4 days later, inside an abandoned well nearly half a mile from where he was last seen. Once again, Timothy Caldwell volunteered to join the search party. He didn't act like a kid waiting for adults. He kept pace. He endured. He guided adults through terrain that even longtime residents struggled to navigate. When asked how he knew the woods so well, Timothy explained he explored for medicinal plants and herbs his aunt could use for cooking and treatment. Then, on the 4th day, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin shortly after dawn. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father. He said he heard crying, coming from a hidden location where the well was partially concealed by fallen logs and overgrown brush. Jacob was alive, barely conscious, suffering from dehydration and exposure. Harding was summoned, and Jacob was pulled from the well soon enough to survive long enough for Harding to arrive. But Jacob died anyway. He had been at the bottom of the well for nearly 4 days, and the damage was too much. What disturbed Harding most wasn't only that Timothy could find the well so quickly. It was Timothy's behavior in the cabin during Jacob's final hours. While the Mills family watched Jacob and held vigil, Timothy sat quietly in the corner, apparently praying. But Harding, watching closely from a position where Timothy didn't realize he was being observed, saw something else. Timothy's lips moved, but it didn't look like prayer. His eyes stayed fixed on Jacob, as if he were carefully cataloging what would happen next. Harding later described it as nearly scientific. The breathing pattern, the pallor of the skin, the moments when consciousness flickered. When Jacob finally died, Timothy's expression showed no grief or shock. Instead, Harding described a look that felt like satisfaction. After Jacob's funeral, Harding returned to the abandoned well alone. This place troubled him more than anything else. The rescue team had missed something. Harding realized the debris around the well's rim wasn't random. Logs and branches that should have fallen naturally had been arranged with deliberate precision, forming camouflage that would be nearly impossible to notice unless you already knew where to look. Harding couldn't say it out loud, not then, but he believed Jacob Mills hadn't fallen into the well by accident. Someone had placed him and hidden the well until it was too late. That night, Harding began keeping detailed notes about Timothy Caldwell. If Harding was correct, the child wasn't merely unlucky. The child was dangerous. Still, suspicions weren't evidence, and Harding lacked evidence strong enough to convince authorities. The problem was that Timothy Caldwell was by all appearances a perfect child. He went to church regularly. He sat properly. He recited prayers correctly. He worked hard on the farm. He treated elders respectfully. He looked harmless. And in a world like 1867 Missouri, it mattered what people thought was possible. Harding's training forced him to see past appearances. War had shown him that violence could come from people who didn't look monstrous at all. Harding learned to recognize killers who weren't motivated by desperation or patriotism. Killers whose emotional detachment appeared in subtle ways. Men who talked about suffering with clinical indifference. Men who didn't react the way others did to horror. Timothy Caldwell showed those signs, only compressed into a child's body. Harding's investigation began in earnest in October 1866. As physician, he made regular visits to farms and homes across the region. He did it for normal medical reasons, but in reality, he was gathering information about Timothy. And what he found deepened the pattern. Livestock across neighboring farms were dying at unusual rates. Not from disease, but from injuries that looked accidental, except they weren't random. Chickens were found with broken necks. Pigs were found with wounds that became infected and led to death. Horses developed sudden lameness, so severe farmers had to put them down. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson confided in Harding about her losses. She told him her chickens were dying 1 or 2 at a time, always in the morning, and the way it happened was too neat. Her husband believed it was foxes, but she had never seen fox signs around the coop. The deaths weren't just happening. They were happening in consistent, specific ways. When Harding examined the latest casualties, he found evidence that supported Eleanor's suspicion. The chickens had been killed with precise force applied to specific points on their necks, something that required knowledge of anatomy, not just rage or panic. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. James Wickham lost calves due to freak accidents, animals that seemed to strangle themselves on ropes or wedge their heads into fence rails. Robert Dunham's prize bull broke a leg after falling into a ditch, despite being one of the county's sure-footed animals. And in every instance, the farms were within walking distance of the Caldwell property. More than once, neighbors reported seeing Timothy near the time of the incidents. "I saw him walking along our fence line the morning before we found the calf," one farmer told Harding. The boy had been polite, waving and greeting him like he was taught to do. Then Harding started paying closer attention during his medical visits to the Caldwell household. Timothy was always there. He stood quietly as Harding checked Thomas and Sarah. He didn't seem bored or restless, but he watched with unusual interest. At one point, Timothy asked Harding questions that sounded far beyond normal curiosity. Questions about anatomy, about death, about survival. "How do you know if someone's really dead?" he asked casually. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." When Harding pressed him, Timothy explained he wanted to know how to help in emergencies, because the farm was so far from town. That explanation sounded reasonable. But what disturbed Harding was how clinical Timothy's fascination was. Timothy asked how long people took to die. He asked what signs to look for. He seemed detached, like someone studying a subject rather than confronting a tragedy. Harding then tested Timothy with deliberately false information. He told Timothy certain injuries were fatal when they weren't, told stories meant to see if Timothy would question or correct him. Timothy didn't challenge the falsehoods directly. Instead, he remembered everything Harding said. And Harding didn't just see curiosity. Harding watched how Timothy listened to battlefield stories. While other children reacted with fear or sadness, Timothy asked detailed questions about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival rates. He asked things like whether wounded soldiers screamed loudly when injured, and if the screaming stopped because the pain was too severe or because the victims were too hurt to make noise. His question arrived politely, and it still sent a chill through Harding. By November 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 journals with observations about Timothy. Harding's conclusion was not comfortable. A child who had an adult understanding of violence and death, and who displayed what looked like an absence of normal empathy. But again, documentation wasn't the same thing as proof. Harding still needed evidence. Then an opportunity arrived. Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the fall harvest. The injury required bed rest and daily visits. That meant Harding could spend more time inside the home, more time observing, more time questioning, more time getting close enough to find what he needed. During these visits, Harding discovered something that exceeded his worst fears. Timothy Caldwell had been conducting experiments on living creatures, maybe for months, possibly longer. Harding learned this through questioning and observation. Timothy described a cave where he went to think and be alone. Harding visited that cave, and what he found was organized. There was a collection of animal bones, crude surgical instruments made from farm tools, and drawings, detailed drawings, showing animals in stages of injury and dissection. Rabbits, squirrels, birds. Each drawing had notes describing animals' reactions and estimates of how long the deaths took. The handwriting was Timothy's. The skill and precision didn't match an 8-year-old in Harding's mind. One note, beside a rabbit drawing, described how a subject remained conscious for around 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after pressure applied to the throat. Harding realized Timothy had been using community animals as subjects for increasingly sophisticated cruelty. The accidental deaths weren't random. They were tests. But the most chilling discovery came next. Harding found newer drawings depicting human figures instead of animals. The sketches included children and adults in poses of injury and distress, each with speculative notes about anatomy and potential methods of causing harm. One drawing resembled Mary Fletcher, the first child to die. Another resembled Henrik Lynn. And another showed Jacob Mills at the bottom of a well, with annotations about dehydration and exposure. In other words, Timothy Caldwell didn't just happen to be there. Timothy planned. Timothy executed. Timothy documented. And Harding, at last, had something prosecutors could understand. But he also faced another problem. How do you prove this without the evidence being thrown out? Harding had gathered evidence through a search that might be considered illegal, depending on how authorities viewed it. And the bigger issue was this. The idea that an 8-year-old child could be a calculating murderer felt impossible to 1867 minds. Most people believed children were inherently innocent, corrupted only by bad influences, trauma, bad parents, anything else. The prevailing belief did not allow for the idea that a child could be born without empathy or conscience. So even with evidence, Harding knew they might label him insane or biased. He decided not to wait. Instead, Harding confronted Timothy directly. During his next visit, Harding asked Timothy to walk with him to check livestock in the far pasture. He used the errand as cover, to get alone time away from witnesses. When they were by themselves, Harding revealed what he found in the cave, the drawings, the notes, the organized cruelty. Timothy listened carefully. He showed no fear, no shock, no denial. He simply nodded occasionally, as if Harding was confirming details Timothy already expected him to know. Then Timothy said something Harding would never forget. "You're not going to tell anyone?" Harding asked why. Timothy replied with his first truly genuine expression of emotion, a smile that reached none of his pale blue eyes, but looked real all the same. "Because no one would believe you," Timothy said, "and because you're curious about what I'll do next." In that moment, Harding understood something about Timothy that was worse than his cruelty. Timothy understood people. He understood that even professionals could be manipulated, especially if what Timothy did sounded too unbelievable. Harding asked how long Timothy had been doing all of this. Timothy answered matter-of-factly, "Since I was 5. Maybe earlier. He started with insects, then mice, then larger things. He said it was interesting to see how different animals reacted to the same treatments. And he claimed that people were better at understanding what was happening, which made it more interesting." Harding asked what Timothy planned next. Timothy thought seriously before answering. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely. Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." The implication was terrifying. Timothy wasn't planning to stop. Timothy was planning to kill Thomas and Sarah, the very people who had raised him. Harding knew he might have only hours. That evening, Harding went to see Sheriff William Crawford. Crawford was practical, a Union veteran with little patience for theories. But he trusted Harding and was willing to listen to evidence. Harding presented his case carefully, focusing on verifiable facts. He showed Crawford the drawings and notes from the cave. He pointed out the pattern of deaths around Timothy. He emphasized Timothy's unusual knowledge and his ability to describe anatomy, drowning, injury, and death mechanics. And then Harding delivered the most important piece of information. Timothy had stated his intention to kill his aunt and uncle. Crawford reviewed the evidence and studied the drawings with mounting alarm. Even as a veteran, the anatomical precision shocked him. So they developed a plan. Crawford arranged trusted deputies who could remain steady under pressure. Harding would arrive, as usual, with supplies, and would be used to keep Thomas and Sarah sedated, enough to prevent Timothy from easily harming them. Crawford and deputies would position around the property in concealed locations, close enough to respond quickly, far enough to avoid detection. The plan took effect the next morning. Harding approached the farmhouse in his buggy. Something was wrong immediately. No chickens moved in the yard. No pigs grunted in their pen. The usual rhythm of farm life was absent. The property sat too quiet. Harding's skin crawled. Timothy appeared in the doorway before Harding even fully climbed down from the buggy. Timothy stood perfectly still, eyes tracking Harding like prey tracks a hunter. He smiled and greeted Harding politely. "I've been waiting for you," Timothy said. Then Harding noticed the details. The sleeves rolled up past his elbows, hands recently scrubbed clean like preparation. Harding found Thomas and Sarah in their bedroom. They were lying as if asleep, but when Harding approached, Thomas's breathing looked shallow, skin grayish and pale. Harding turned to Timothy. "What did you give them?" Timothy replied innocently. "Some herbs I found in the woods." Harding checked Thomas's pulse, weak but steady. Sarah's condition looked similar. Whatever it was, Timothy had dosed it carefully. He didn't want dead bodies. He wanted helpless victims. "They're not going to wake up for several hours," Timothy continued, as if discussing a timetable. And then he did something that made Harding feel helpless. Timothy spoke about killing with the clinical detachment of a professor. He described his methods like explanations in a lesson. Drowning, he said, wasn't instant. It was slow, with a struggle and a pattern of breathing before the body gives up. He described Mary Fletcher's death, how he held her head beneath the water until she stopped fighting. Harding's blood turned cold. Timothy then spoke about Henrik Lynn. He explained he couldn't overpower him physically, so he used creativity. He loosened stones near the bluff the night before. He collected bees and prepared a cloth bag. Then he waited behind rocks. When Henrik climbed, Timothy threw the bees and shouted about a swarm. Henrik panicked. He stumbled. He fell, through a weakened barrier Timothy had prepared. Harding realized Timothy hadn't just guessed. Timothy had planned. Then came Jacob Mills. Timothy said Jacob was more interesting because he didn't die quickly. He wanted to see what would happen when death came slowly, over several days. He convinced Jacob to follow him into the woods by claiming to find baby raccoons. Jacob came without suspicion. Timothy led him down the path to the well, moved logs and brush to hide it, then returned each day with just enough water to keep Jacob alive, but not enough to let him recover. Timothy described Jacob's dehydration and exposure like a textbook entry. Then Harding realized the truth. Timothy wasn't talking hypothetically. He was describing what he had already done. And now he was preparing to do the same to the people currently in the room. Harding tried to stop him. He drew a pistol and ordered Timothy to step away from knives he had gathered nearby, rope, candlesticks, kitchen tools, all laid out with methodical care. But Timothy wasn't afraid. He was interested. When Harding asked what Timothy planned, Timothy spoke about a new kind of experiment. What happens when someone knows what Timothy is and still tries to protect others? Harding understood the trap. Even if he shot Timothy, he would have to be careful with limited ammunition. Timothy appeared ready for every angle. Timothy got closer. He asked Harding how many bullets the pistol held. Harding answered automatically, then regretted it immediately. Timothy pointed out that even with the entire supply, there weren't enough bullets to stop him and protect everyone at once, implying that Timothy had predicted Harding's response. Then Timothy acted. He moved with sudden speed, producing a kitchen knife. He slashed Harding's arm. Harding fought back, but Timothy was faster and more agile than expected, using blades with practice. Harding eventually twisted Timothy's wrist, forcing the knife down. But Timothy had prepared more. He produced another blade from his clothing, and weapons were positioned around the room like a planned operation. Harding's struggle alerted Crawford's deputies. They burst through the back door. They found Harding struggling with Timothy, while Thomas and Sarah remained unconscious, still under the effects of what Timothy had given them. The deputies subdued Timothy quickly. Harding checked Thomas and Sarah, confirming their lives were intact. In the end, the boy sat calmly in the corner, his clothes torn, his face bloodied. But his pale blue eyes carried the same cold intelligence Harding first felt months earlier. Timothy said something that sounded like a statement of inevitability. "You can't prove anything. Nobody will believe a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford responded with brutal practicality. "Maybe not," Crawford said, "but you attempted to murder your family with a knife. That's enough to lock you up." Timothy smiled again. "You won't hang me," he said confidently. "I'm too young and too interesting. Someone would want to study him instead." And that, in the end, was what happened. When Crawford tried to present Harding's cave evidence to county prosecutors, the response was exactly what Harding predicted. Drawings and notes were dismissed as the work of a disturbed child, trauma playing out in cruel fantasies. Accidents were blamed on coincidence, and on Timothy's reputation for being helpful during emergencies. But the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah couldn't be dismissed. 3 law enforcement officers had seen Timothy attack sleeping relatives with clear intent to kill. An 8-year-old could not easily be explained away as accidental. The legal system of 1867 had no real framework for dealing with violent children. He was too young for adult prosecution, too dangerous for simple placement in an orphanage. So the case grew beyond Sedalia County. Legal scholars and medical professionals began arriving from across the region. Eventually, after weeks of debate and consultation, including experts from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, a compromise formed. Timothy Caldwell would be remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be studied and treated by leading alienists. It was the kind of decision that left no one satisfied. Prosecutors wanted a harsher punishment. Defense attorneys argued that a child that young could not truly be held responsible. Medical professionals disagreed. Some believed Timothy could be rehabilitated, while others believed him irreversibly dangerous. Dr. Samuel Harding volunteered to accompany Timothy and remained there for 3 months, documenting everything he could. The resulting case study became one of the first systematic examinations of antisocial behavior in children. And the hospital staff soon realized something even darker than before. Timothy adapted. He learned hospital routines quickly. He learned how to mimic emotions. When staff tried to measure his progress, Timothy offered the performance. He cried convincingly. He apologized with seeming remorse. He showed gratitude. It looked like rehabilitation. But Harding observed what professionals rarely want to admit. Timothy wasn't feeling anything. He was studying. He was training himself to manipulate the people around him. Harding wrote that Timothy could produce the right expressions: happiness when someone wanted good news, sadness when he needed others to help. But Timothy never experienced the emotion underneath. Extended observation made it clear the remorse was artificial. Harding also reported that Timothy's violent fantasies weren't diminishing. They were growing more elaborate. He began sharing ideas for future experiments, ideas that made his previous crimes look almost restrained. When these records were later summarized, Harding's notes suggested Timothy would become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history if he gained adulthood and more resources. Timothy stayed at the hospital for 18 months. During that time, strange incidents occurred, deaths that looked accidental at first but later resembled patterns. Several elderly patients died after interactions with Timothy that resembled heart failure, even though their health had been relatively stable beforehand. 2 younger patients suffered injuries from what were described as accidental falls, but the timing and location suggested Timothy had been near them earlier that day. Some attendants reported seeing Timothy at night. Not like a patient leaving his room. Like a silent presence standing beside beds and watching people sleep. Nurses reported nightmares. Not vague nightmares. Detailed ones featuring violence and death scenarios that sounded disturbingly similar to what Timothy had described earlier in life. Even staff, who worked closely with him, started requesting transfers. Eventually, Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, brought in as an additional expert, discovered that Timothy had kept a secret journal. The journal appeared childlike on the surface. Simple handwriting, emotionally appropriate language, entries describing regret and hope. But Fitzgerald recognized something else: coded communication. When she analyzed the text, she found the journal contained cipher messages, decoded, revealing Timothy's true intentions. He wasn't studying the world to heal. He was studying it to plan. His goal wasn't simply escape. It was to refine his techniques in a place designed to restrain him. Day 47 in the journal described how Dr. Fitzgerald believed his tears were authentic, how her responses showed increased sympathy and reduced suspicion, and how consistent performance would be required before physical contact during sessions. Then the hospital tightened security. Timothy shifted tactics. He stopped trying to manipulate staff through direct access and instead gathered information about routines, security habits, and potential escape routes. In the summer of 1868, Timothy Caldwell disappeared. The official report claimed he escaped during a transfer between buildings despite constant supervision by multiple guards. But Harding believed the official story was incomplete. Harding suspected Timothy had planned this for months. Evidence suggested he had subtly manipulated staff policy in the weeks before his disappearance. Small exceptions. Slightly longer exercise periods. More reading time. Minor adjustments to his routine. Each change alone may have seemed harmless, but together, they likely created the opportunity for escape. After he vanished, Dr. Harding began collecting reports of suspicious deaths across the Midwest. Some incidents resembled Timothy's earlier methods: staged accidents with deliberate planning, animal torture evidence, a child who seemed unusually helpful, emotionally mature, and eerily connected to each tragedy. Harding's greatest fear was what would happen now that Timothy might be older, strong enough to overpower adults, clever enough to avoid repeating the mistakes that got him captured. Harding spent the remainder of his career trying to identify and understand what Timothy Caldwell truly represented. After Harding died in 1891, his final journals were discovered. They contained hundreds of pages, not only case reports, but philosophical discussion about the nature of evil. Harding's conclusion was disturbing. Timothy wasn't an aberration. He was something like a glimpse into what a human being could become if moral and emotional restraints were removed. He implied that if Timothy survived into adulthood, then somewhere in America, there was a man who understood human psychology better than any professional, and who could view others as subjects for experimentation. Eventually, the Caldwell farm itself was abandoned. After Thomas and Sarah recovered, they could not stay in the place where they had unknowingly sheltered a killer for nearly 2 years. The property eventually reverted to the county and was sold to developers in the 1890s. But local residents avoided the area for decades afterward. The cave where Timothy conducted his experiments was sealed by Sheriff Crawford shortly after Timothy's arrest. Animals allegedly refused to graze near it, and local legends claim the cave was cursed. Dr. Harding's journals were donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1923 by his daughter, who believed their scientific value outweighed the disturbing nature of their contents. Researchers could access them if they could demonstrate legitimate academic interest. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke publicly about Timothy again. They lived under assumed names for the rest of their lives, apparently fearing the boy might return. Sarah died in 1889. Thomas followed in 1894. Neither had children, and in his final journal entry, written just days before his death in 1891, Dr. Harding reflected one last time on the implication of Timothy Caldwell's case. He feared he had reached a conclusion that was hard to accept. Timothy wasn't a one-time tragedy. He was evidence that some people might be born without empathy or conscience, born without the emotional breaks society assumes were universal. So now the question remains, do you believe everything was revealed? Or is it possible that the official record did more than it uncovered? Because with a case like Timothy Caldwell's, the scariest possibility isn't that evil wears a mask. It's that we might never notice the mask until it's far too late. If you're still with us, tell us what you think in the comments. Do you think Timothy truly disappeared and died quietly? Or do you believe his story ended early, and the rest is still buried somewhere in American history? And if this video gave you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.